Hi, everyone. Welcome to the EdUpAI podcast. I'm Jason Gulia, and we are really dedicating our time on this podcast to having the really important conversations about artificial intelligence and education and how it intersects with society and everything else that we're really trying to figure out as we move forward. So I'm really excited today. I'm talking to Josh Thorpe. So he is a learning developer and writer, and he works at the University of Sterling. And he also, in addition to doing that work, wrote a really good graphic novel, which I've been reading piece by piece. So it's called AI for Students, and he gives a lot of and there he goes. He holds it up for you. A lot of within the graphic novel itself, really important ideas and hacks and tips for approaching this technology in a way that actually boosts our learning as opposed to just offloading it. And there is that tendency for many of us to do that. So first of all, Josh, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Jason. It's a privilege to speak with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited. We've interacted online. I think we've interacted on Facebook too,
Yeah.
in that small group of AI and education. And it's been so great getting just to talk to you and learn about what you're doing and have your very creative approach, which I really like. So, I guess we'll start with thinking about or talking about your book. So, with AI for students. So, what were you focusing on there? If you can just give our audience a little bit of a tip of what you were doing there and how it intersects with what you do, right? So, as a learning developer and writer, how did that project come to be and how does it relate to what you're doing on an everyday basis now?
Well, in my work, I work one-to-one with students and with student groups, and I work with lecturers to sort of solve problems, right? So, I mean, essentially, my job is to address the so-called hidden curriculum, the academic literacies, academic skills that don't normally get taught in schools, in university, pretty much anywhere. So, things that people stumble upon or absorb if they're lucky, but not equitably, right? So you get just all these people who are struggling to get things done at university, and nobody has told them there are ways to do things that might help, right? So that's kind of my job, is to find those things and connect the right tools with the right people, the right protocols, strategies, ways of thinking, and so on. And it's very interesting work. Students love it, lecturers love it, and it's really sort of satisfying in that way. I'm also very closely focused on the student experience, right? And the psychological experience of learning, neurodiverse experiences, um, and just the very particular sort of habits and moods that people bring to that very strange learning situation, writing situation that we're in as well. So that's the world that I kind of interact with on a daily basis. And then as a writer, you know, I'm I'm very aware of that process and my cognitive sort of experience as I'm doing that. And so when ChatGPT came out in November 2022, I basically was thrown into a panic, as many of us were. It's like, what the heck do we do now? And I saw everyone around me in the same panic, and so that's where the book really began. Is from both the teacher perspective and the writer perspective. How do I sort of figure this out in a way that doesn't completely overwhelm me?
Yeah, and I do very much think that we see that focus on individual students and really individuals in general built into the book. One of the ideas that you bring up again and again in that graphic novel is that so little of it is about the technology itself, and so
Mm.
much of it is about the mindset that we have when we interact with this technology. And one of the things that I saw, and I'd be interested to hear if you saw something a little bit different. I saw was really so for many of us when ChatGPT came out and students were using it very quickly and pretty early on, at least my students were. And there was this panic. And then many of us just got obsessed or really focused on the tech itself. Right. And I think many people haven't actually gotten past this yet, that
Mhm.
they're so focused on what's going on with technology, what the developments are, and trying to track each and everything. And I think that one of the really transformative things for me, and it seems like, based off the book and our conversations, you've had this turn too, but that there needs to be a way in which we think about the technology, but we also look past it. We look at the student, we put it in context. We don't just focus on that. We think about what we can actually do to encourage our students to actually use it in a way that boosts their learning. So, from the student side, based off of the conversations you've had, where do you think a lot of your students are? Do you think many of them are just sort of getting started? Are many of them just focusing on the tech and the tech alone? Or do you see some students who are starting to make that move and thinking about, how does this really help me out? What should I be offloading? What shouldn't I be offloading? So how do you see your students? And I know I'm asking a general question, so feel free to be much more nuanced with this, but how do you see many of your students interacting with this technology, and how do you see them thinking about it?
The whole gamut. I mean, everything that you've just described is represented in the students that I've worked with, and I think that the surveys that I've seen support that too. You have students who have never heard of AI, don't care, would prefer not to, or just don't have time. Then you have students who are doing the obvious and simply outsourcing as much as they can because they're treating their university experience or whatever learning experience very instrumentally. They just want the piece of paper. And if you go on TikTok and search for, AI keyword student or something like that, you'll get all these really depressing tips from student to student about how to like cheat and how to humanize your AI generated text,
Yes,
etc.
don't do it. It's depressing.
Yeah. And then you get people who are just a bit curious but scared. They don't want to do anything wrong. And then others who have a very sophisticated relationship to this new technology already, who are using it very thoughtfully, have gone through a lot of the thought processes that we talk about on some of the sort of educator forums that we've been involved in, and are able to bring that to their fellow students, which is really encouraging too, like in a class discussion, show that there's a nuanced way of using these technologies.
Yeah, I think that that's huge. And one of the things I really want educators to think about when we approach AI, regardless of where we are in our journey, whether we're really pushing against it or incorporating it, something in the middle, wherever we are, I think we have to think very, very seriously and as collaboratively as we can about what models our students have. One of the big things is that if we don't give them models, if we don't show them, oh, I'm going to write this thing and I'm going to use AI to empower myself, and here's how I'm going to do it. If we don't give students these models, those models will be taken from TikTok, right? They're going to come from those other places when they start to see this technology. And that's where I think we have to be very, very careful about talking to students very openly about it, showing our own processes, right? This is, for me, technology is a big push to be as transparent with our students as we can about what we are doing, what we are playing with, and also what decisions we're making. And this is where I want to go with my question. I want to ask you about student agency. It's a big part of your book, right? And so when we go and we use this technology, being able to make decisions about how we are using it. And one of the things that I've sort of learned as I've talked to students and talked to faculty is that AI has brought up a lot, right? A lot that that was wrong for a long time in the educational systems. And one of the big things has to do with student agency. That many of my students, when I give them the option of using AI in their assignments and I walk them through and I scaffold things and I give them models and stuff like that, that many of my students are very, very quick to give away their agency, right? Just completely just hand it over to the machine. And I don't blame them at all for that. And for many of them, that is something that the educational model that they're used to has rewarded, right? That it's not about agency. It's about doing what your teacher or your professor wants you to do. And so I think that it is part of a larger conversation. So has that been your experience as well? That as you have conversations with these students and you learn about their approaches to it, do you find yourself thinking more and more about student agency or other models I would say, negative models or myths with educational forms and educational institutions. So what are the big conversations that you're having as you talk to students, if you are having them?
Well, it's yes. The default approach is kind of the AI as vending machine, right? It's like it's giving me something. I don't have to think. And that's a perfect analogy, really, because often a vending machine is junk food we're getting. It's an easy solution. We're not having to think too much about it. We're not putting effort into preparing our own food and so on. And yet, most of us know from experience that when we have the opportunity and resources, making our own meal is probably going to be in many ways more fulfilling, certainly more nourishing than a candy bar. So, you know, that's kind of a nice way to think about it for me. And uh, rather than treating the technology as that, or a slot machine, or a content mill, I talk with students about treating it as any of a number of different type models or metaphors, a study buddy, an environment to work within, a space for thinking, a stage to practice on, or an audience to practice to. A lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be that overly anthropomorphized model, but it could be. I think we need to be wary of that, but it's useful in certain ways as well. But yeah, the whole idea is, what do we keep for ourselves when we use these technologies, and how aware of, how reflective are we upon our own experience, the cognitive experience of using these technologies, the psychological experience, and then just how much we are like aware of the new sort of relationship with authorship we have, or with knowledge management we have, or with consumer knowledge consumption we have when we use these technologies. And like, are we doing this in a fairly self-aware manner, or are we just simply doing the easy thing? So that's the conversation I try to have. It turns out for me that it's almost always more fun, more interesting, and more valuable to do the thing that's more work for me. So I don't use the tools much in that content generation sort of mode, because I find then it actually hasn't done anything for me. It's a bit like reading a textbook and then trying to take an exam afterwards. If you haven't used the knowledge, it's not part of you.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And one of the things that's so refreshing about your approach, and I'm going to quote you in a second. I was looking up what I wanted to quote from you. So, thinking about AI as this space, this environment, this place where we can really own our own ideas and actually, if we have a certain approach, if we have a certain mindset, we can use it to boost ourselves or augment itself. What sort of language you want to use? And so that it's, when we have this approach, it's not so much about the outputs, right? That sort of transactional model. It's not so much about create this for me and then saying, oh, wasn't that cool? I'm going to use that. It's much more about what it generates in you, right?
Yes.
So that as you interact with these generative AI programs, being able to really think in a very self-reflective way about what thoughts start to percolate. And so you published inside higher ed this idea, and I'd be super interested to hear you kind of walk through this. So you wrote about how the book demonstrates how AI tech can be used not as magic powers or even as tools, but more as interactive spaces or virtual classrooms. In this type of scenario, students learn to use technology not to outsource their brains, but in fact to think more creatively and actively, and to have fun along the way. So can you walk through that a little bit? So how do you see this sort of AI approach working? We think about AI as this kind of laboratory for ideas, so we can bounce some ideas off of it and actually put ourselves in a creative thinking spot. So if you can walk through that idea, which I think is really, really important for your book and the other work that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, the essential model I think that I describe in that article is really what the book does, and it flips that content mill equation on its head and says, don't ask the bot to do something for you. Ask the bot to ask you to do something. Really, that's what it boils down to. So an LLM, an AI, will then become the spark for some thinking, the beginning of a thought process, or a touch point along the way. This all started for me when I first started playing with ChatGPT and asked the obvious thing, write me a joke about chickens in the style of Jerry Seinfeld. And what I got back was 3 paragraphs, very wordy, slightly disappointing, but kind of funny, right? So then two things. I had to edit the joke down to make it more Seinfeld-esque, more of what I considered to be a decent joke, and then the next thing I realized was that, well, that was the fun part, actually. So the fact that I had to edit it to get there was sort of revelation 1. Revelation 2 was it was more fun to edit the joke than to have the joke. Do you know what I mean? So this active, the creative work that I was ending up doing on my own, it was enabled by this interaction with the technology, and I valued that. But I valued the work that I did subsequently more. And I found that, a few interactions like that had me then, I was then making up my own jokes and asking the bot to critique the joke. My jokes were not good. The critiques were not bad, but not like Scholar of Humor good. But what was valuable there was that I don't have anyone in my life that I can talk to about writing a joke. I don't know anybody who likes to talk about that. So here I am talking with ChatGPT about that, and not something that I know how seriously I want to take, not seriously how much I want to put into it. I'm not going to enroll in a night class in joke telling. So, but it then gave me this material to work with, and suddenly I'm watching clips of old time comedians listening to the rhythm of the language, the music of joke telling, the pace, the structure of jokes in ways that I hadn't before, because I had never opened that conversation for myself. I'm walking away, I'm talking with my partner about jokes, I'm doing the dishes, thinking about jokes. So it doesn't end at the interaction, right? If you approach it in this way, it can be the spark, and then you take that elsewhere. It doesn't have to be tied to the screen.
And I think that's huge. And I think that there are ways to really model for students how that works. And so for many of our students, and I think that many times I see this fact belittled, they don't really have someone to workshop with. Right? Mm-hmm. So for me, if I'm thinking about an article or writing a book or whatever I'm doing, I have people who I can bring along. I have this network. I can send it to colleagues and say, all right, read this, and I'll read something of yours, and we'll have a back and forth. And so I have this network. And the students have a version of that in the classroom, but it is very, very different. And so I think that, we often, or I've seen belittled how powerful this technology can be for having an interlocutor, having someone who you can actually have this sort of conversation with. Because for many of us, we are, and myself included, I'm a part of this criticism. I am a part of a scholarly network. If I need someone to weigh in on something, I have people I can do that with. And many of my students do not. And there's a lot of vulnerability with doing it in the classroom. And then the other thing I do think is promising about this technology is if a student is struggling with something, or anyone is struggling with something, we have this interlocutor where we can hit reset. And that's really, really valuable, that we can run it again. And there are some ways in which that's a good thing, and some cases in which that's a bad thing. But being able to, say we're struggling with something, say it's something creative, something we're not quite sure how to understand, and we learn to use these chatbots or whatever AI becomes, and we can throw ideas back and forth, and we can always run again. Right? Mm-hmm. We can open up a new chat, try a different perspective. And there's that sort of play to it, which I find incredibly freeing. Because yes, all of us want our students to really practice interpersonal communication and all of that. But there's also something nice about having a laboratory, right? A laboratory for ideas, a space for ideas where you can always hit reset. You can kind of say, oh, that really didn't work, right? I didn't get something out of that I wanted to get out of it. So I'm just going to open a new chat and I'm going to try it again. I'm going to reset it up, or I'm going to try maybe a different AI program. And there is something very playful about that. And a lot of it does come down to mindset. It comes down to having this creative approach. Now, Josh, when you work with students, what model do you often see them coming with? I often am tempted to kind of jump past that point because I want them to take the creative approach. I want them to take, one that really bolsters them as thinkers and as people who are just working through the world. So is your sense that students come in with a very kind of transactional approach, where they're not really like playing with the outputs or things like that? Or are you seeing students come in with creative approaches when they're seeing AI as something to have a conversation with, to get their ideas going? So how do you see your students, when you first start talking about technology, how do you see them approaching?
Well, my sense is that it's pretty directly tied to however they think of all of the other interactions that they have with knowledge, and technology. That if they haven't figured out for themselves what their aims are, their values, if they haven't got a bit of a sense of something that they like in the world and that they're good at, and so on, if they haven't sort of begun to think about those things, or if no one has helped them to think about those things, then they're not great at understanding what the value of doing any assessment might be, or going to lectures might be. They don't have the enthusiasm that they need to be intrinsically sort of involved in learning. And I'm not talking about, deep learning versus strategic learning type distinctions. Just that sense of being curious and being able to see yourself within the landscape that you're trying to navigate, and like that I should be here. I should ask questions here. I should interact with this thing, this body of knowledge, and the people involved in it. So if that's not there, then I think students are more likely to treat AI in the same way and sort of just be like, well, how can I make this do something for me that I don't want to do? And that, then that ties to all kinds of other behaviors of procrastination and that are tied to brain science and habits and self-worth and so on. But if students do have some sense that they're curious, that they have a role, that they could imagine a path for themselves in this new world that they're trying to enter, and that's such a valuable thing to be able to have, and that I think fundamentally need to get better at as a sector. If they have that, then they can start to use AI tools in ways that are more creative and more nurturing to themselves. But you mentioned something, vulnerability, which is quite interesting, and I saw your post about that recently. I think it's a key opportunity with these technologies, right? Is that students don't have an sort of equal or equitable access to being vulnerable and being okay with it, right? And we're not good at generally in higher education or in education in general, not good at making spaces that level the playing field there. And one of the things that we love to talk about is critical thinking, and we don't really teach it. We don't. I mean, I'm vastly generalizing here, so I'm sure there's loads of people who really do, but who are listening. But as a sector, in higher ed, critical thinking is thrown about as this fantastic practice that we all do and we love to do and we're all good at, and just come on, guys, I want to coax it out of you. But it requires vulnerability and play, risk taking, experimentation, and so AI tools provide one way of accessing that we didn't have before, that students have some private access to if they can access these tools.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think you're totally right. And as academics who've gone through the system and are publishing books and teaching classes, doing all those things, I think we start to, and I put myself in this group, we start to lose touch with that. We start to lose touch with just how difficult it can be for our students to have that kind of vulnerability. And there's always this sort of weird combination, right? Is vulnerability, and to be vulnerable and be willing to be vulnerable, you have to be confident. That has to be a huge part of it too, that you have to be able to, if we're thinking about it in the traditional classroom format, go in and just walk through your ideas and have people say, oh, that was right, that was wrong, here's what I think. And yes, I'd like to think that we're creating systems that allow for that, but many of my students in my classroom don't have that. They have really struggled with figuring out, with being that sort of vulnerable, that having that kind of vulnerability. And one of the things that I think a lot about is how transactional our educational systems have become. That many of my students are so terrified of making a mistake, like really, really terrified, right? To the extent that, if they feel like if they are going to experiment with something, they might get an F and they're not going to get through college and they're not going to get their degree and they're going to waste thousands of dollars. The stakes get that big so quickly. And so I think that that's one of the things that's really interesting to me about AI as a space for experimentation. Right, that and it takes some work. We can create these spaces where, no, it's not entirely judgment free, but if we're really, really careful with it, we can use it to sort of scaffold that. Because one of the things that I sort of lament is how many of my students, and I don't blame them for this at all, they are very risk averse. Right? That they're willing to say, well, this is tied to money, this is tied to my degree, this is tied to me getting a job. And so, and I don't blame them at all. I'm going to take a low risk set of actions. And so one of the things that's interesting to me is that in a certain way, we can use AI, as long as we're purposeful with it, to encourage experimentation, trying something out. One of the things that I've done is, if a student tries something out and it just didn't work, just try again, right? And trying to make that just a normal part of the thing. And with AI, at least for me, as this tool, it's just so much easier because you always have that reset button. Because if a student is coming into a classroom, you can try to reset and there's a way to do it, but you really can't. But with this technology, it's probably the closest, at least for me, that you can get to just trying a scenario again and again until you start to get it. And that's really sort of freeing for me. And does that jive with what you're thinking about in terms of using this technology to kind of draw students in and basically give them a chance to experiment with ideas and models, maybe in a way that's relatively low pressure, right? Because they're interacting with a bot or something like that as opposed to a human.
Yes, I mean, what you say about risk aversion is bang on for me. I think it's one of the great tragedies of our time that, or maybe this is of all time, that we somehow set up this system of expectations that's based on assessment of a certain type in a certain manner that encourages students to not want to make mistakes. And we've got this, we've got this environment where many students don't really understand that the mistake making is essential, not just a natural part of the process, but actually essential to it. I mean, the brain science is clear. We learn when we make mistakes, and even the most fundamental thing of active recall, where you learn something, you don't look at it, you try to remember it, you try to use it, that hurts your brain. That is the discomfort that produces the confidence that follows. And even that, I think, is not really understood by most of us most of the time, because I don't know, our culture right now avoids discomfort of all kinds, unless it feeds some kind of dopamine cycle, right? Shock is a type of discomfort that social media encourages. The algorithms like that type of discomfort because it feeds that attention cycle. But in general, we avoid it, and it becomes this. It's systematized, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and everything, at least in my experience, everything is so high stakes. My
Yes,
students come to me, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them do struggle with seeing conversation as a place to experiment with ideas, because it's always tied to assessment. Everything is tied to assessment, and not just assessment, but high stakes assessment.
Yeah.
That many of my students, and they tell me this is not something I'm projecting onto them, but they feel like if they're taking a college class, by the time they get to week 2 or 3, they feel like they're already being categorized. They're already being put into an A group or a B group and a C group. And that is it's something that is, and I did this too, that they're so used to. And we're also terrified about being put into lower categories. And it's just like, for me, ideally education wouldn't do that. That education is about being able to experiment, being able to play around with things. And that's one of the things, and it seems like we very much share this, that's one of the things that's really interesting about AI, because you do have that reset button, right? In a way that, you can just try it again and again and again and again, and you can scaffold it. I think that if we're very careful with this, there are ways that we can use this technology to just encourage that kind of intellectual experimentation, which, yes, you can do in a classroom, and ideally we are doing it in classrooms, but having that sort of scaffolding can be very, very powerful for that. Right? That you try it with a bot first. If it doesn't go to plan, just try it again and just, keep trying it until you feel like you have a handle on it. And that can be very, very freeing for them. And
there's also
go ahead.
There's also a thing about accessibility and diversity and equity here, where there are a number of really important critiques of AI technologies related to these concerns, but there are also a number of opportunities that don't get spoken about that often. And I've got a number of neurodiverse students who have come to me saying that they've been able to find ways to use various AI technologies to brainstorm, to organize themselves, to work with knowledge in this sort of quasi parasocial way that they don't find easy with classmates, in class, on traditional media like paper and pen, and suddenly there's just this new medium for them, and that I find quite exciting. But of course, the implication here is that it also points to a lot of stuff that we haven't been doing great with for some time, and in that case, it's not really about AI or not AI. It's about what these new, very disruptive technologies are causing us to reevaluate, right? And I think that's what's quite interesting about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that your book is very much a part of that conversation. We've been talking for about 33 minutes, so I do want to start to wrap it up, and because you make such an essential point here, right? That one of the things we need to really think about are the big picture things. That I think that there's something about AI that, especially the last couple of years, has really captured the public imagination. We really, really focus on that. And we should focus on that, but we also need to think very seriously about problems with educational systems that have been around for a while, and how we can approach this technology in a way that does boost critical thinking, and a lot of it is about approach and getting students to really be a part of that process, which I think is just so important, right? And it's so essential to think about how our students are interacting with technology. I mean, at this point, many of my students have had access to this technology for over 2 years, right? They had access to it for a good portion, or the majority even, of their high school experience. And so being able to really highlight that and think about how so much of it is about our approach to this technology is just so key. And sometimes when I do that, sometimes when I frame it that way, my students sort of know where I'm coming from, and sometimes they don't, and they really sort of struggle with that approach. And I think one of the best things we can do for them is to model things, bring them into the conversation, and really give them multiple attempts, right? Let them really test things out. I mean, they're in college, they're in school to learn. They're there to test things out, not just to prove that they're smart, but many of my students just want that proving part of education. And that's one of the things that I find very interesting about AI, that we can, if we have a certain approach, use it as an experimental space, right? To throw things around and really test things out. And that's something that we should have been doing for a long time. And now maybe this is a tool we can use to do that. So yeah, we've been talking for like 35 minutes, Josh. Is there anything that we missed? Anything else you want to kind of chime in and talk about for the last few minutes?
There's loads I'd love to talk about with you, Jason. I mean, what do you see next, though? I mean, we've talked about this this usage of AI technologies that's more human centric, that's interactive, that's providing opportunities to spark thought rather than shut it down. But the reality that a lot of us are thinking about, I think, is how the next few years will change education, how it will change the world. If artificial general intelligence or something like it emerges in the next couple of years, as many of the people who are at the center of these things think it will, that will pose some pretty serious existential questions for humanity, right? Like, what do we do with our time now that we have this new technology that's better than us at doing quite a lot of things? What do we do when that is installed in a pair of glasses that we walk around? How does that walk around with? How does that change the value of the way that we harvest data, organize data, share it with each other? How does it change what we want to do with our creative thinking, what we want to consume, and so on? And it's massive on a really fundamental level, but also on a pragmatic one. What do you think, like, institutions should do?
Oh man, I wish I had
teachers
like a
do?
clear answer for that. I feel like someone paid me a lot of money to kind of work through it. Because I think you're right. I think that as this technology gets better, and we're already seeing that, a lot of it is going to be thinking about how we interact with it. And thinking about, I mean, now I think that this coming year is going to really be where AI agents just get better and better and better. They become, so much less LLMs, much less large language models, and much more these agents that we're interacting with. And that's been happening for a while. That's not a new thing. But I sort of expect that many of my students starting to really interact with these programs that way. And I expect to see the approach to change, that my students, and maybe I'm wrong, will start to, I'm already starting to do this, treat these AI bots as more and more personified, right? As something that you can use. It's almost like a super intelligence. And I think that that's starting to hit my students. And many of them, especially if they've been tracking this, and some of them really, really have, worry about that. They're worried about what their place is with these super intelligent bots. And so I think that a lot of it is going to be about collaboration and just being vulnerable in that way, being able to ask those questions. And this is something that I think is huge with education. My experience with a lot of my students is that for many of my students, when they get to my college class, a lot of it is towing the line education. That's what they're really used to, right? They're not used to thinking about these big questions. They're not really thinking about, these kind of mental models that they've been creating, whether they know it or not. It's much more teaching to the test. And so I think it'll be really interesting to kind of figure out, once that becomes, that sort of traditional educational model becomes harder and harder to bolster and keep up. And that's something that'll be very interesting, because that's what I think is going to start to really happen over the next couple of years. That students will start to realize that, oh, my value is different than what my school has taught me or used to teach me. And that's going to be a very interesting moment, I think. When those traditional skills of memorization, right, rote memorization, just don't have the value anymore, right? I think they will still have a value in that larger new world, but I think it's going to be very, very different. right?
Hmm.
That we are going to have to adapt our educational models to start thinking about, beyond rote memorization, because it's just not going to be valued as much in value anymore. It's going to be more about, I think, and I'd love to hear if you have a different idea, figuring out how different kinds of intelligences, human, AI combination, how they interact and how we can use that interaction to come up with different solutions. So I do think that our students will still have a place in that world. We will all have a place in that world, but I think it's going to be very different. And I think it's going to be much more bigger picture and outside the frameworks of some of these models. But
Hmm.
what do you think? I'll ask you too, Josh. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm partly terrified by the magnitude of change that could come in the next 5-10 years, and partly excited. I mean, I want new novel drugs and climate change solutions that nobody ever thought of before. I want all of the promises, all of the utopian possibilities, and if AI can achieve those things, then it's a beautiful thing. But I don't want the bioweapons and bots with guns, So, and I am also just plainly aware of what you mentioned too, like just what is my value, um, and how does that change, and does it change at a pace that I can make sense of? And then institutions are going to be moving at a different pace than individuals, right? So, uh, like universities, they move very slowly for good reason, but I think they need to find ways to do certain things more in a more agile and adaptive manner if they're going to support students and faculty to somehow face this emerging new world with a degree of resilience and self-care.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that I think we can end with because I think it's huge. I
Yeah.
think that this is one of the big conversations that needs to happen, not just for our students, not just for schools, not just for colleges,
No. Yeah.
for us socially. Because I think you're
Right.
right. I think what we're going to see are these use cases for the technology that are going to kind of bring up feelings of terror and feelings of excitement and everything in the middle, that we're going to have these really awful uses of the technology alongside really useful uses of the technology on a social level and individual level. And then the trick, I think, is going to be when you have all of those things. You have the good, you have the bad, you have everything in between, trying to figure out how it doesn't become paralysis. I think that's going to be one of the big questions for us, right? How you can, because you're not going to get everything, right? You need to take one approach over another, but not just feel like we're just handing things off when we don't know what to do and we're going to let things go on their own. Because I think that that's the tendency. So that paralysis is something that I've seen more and more over the last couple of years, and that really worries me. That
Mm-hmm.
approach that, well, the tech's going to do whatever it's going to do, and I can't even shape things, and whatever, I'll just be on the reactive side. And there is a truth to that. That is a part of, I think, of the modern experience. But I think we can overstate that very easily. And so I think that we do need to to move past that reactive side and then figure out how to plan. And this is I think it's gonna be a huge collaborative effort.
Yeah.
And doesn't matter where we are, where we're working, where we're teaching, but figuring out like all that information, you look at as much as possible, but then you really need to have this plan of action. You need to figure out, this is what we're going to do with all of that. And it's never going to be perfect. I
Mm.
think we, in some ways, socially have to become better and better, especially with educational institutions, just not being perfect because we're never going to be, because sometimes we
Yeah.
have to act and build and move from there. So thank you so much, Josh. So it was an absolute pleasure getting to talk to you and hearing your ideas. I love your perspective. I really love your book. So again, for anyone who's interested in this, so this is a graphic novel or comic book. I don't know what you want me to call
Works
it.
for me. Yeah.
Either, yeah, cool. So this is I want to make sure I get the name right. So AI for Students. So here, a lot of this is trying to figure out how to guide students through this process, what's going on with AI, how to use it in a way that actually empowers them, as opposed to handing off that power. And so it's a great book. I highly recommend it. I'll link it in the post and everything so people can find it
Thanks,
and
Jason.
get a sense of your ideas. And Josh, thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
Really enjoyed it, Jason. Thanks for having me on the show.